Welcome.
Thank you,
Twain.
thank you, thank you.
Put you right here and
Very good.
get everything set up. Some tea, wine.
Oh, perhaps some wine.
Okay.
Yes. Very good. Lights. Very good. It's my 70th birthday. 70th birthday. I've known a good many birthdays in my time. I remember the first one very well. I hadn't any hair. I hadn't any teeth. I hadn't any clothes. I had to go to my first banquet like that. That was my cradle song. This is my swan song, I suppose. I'm used to swan songs. Sung them many times. Age is an issue of mind over matter. If you don't mind, it doesn't matter. I have achieved my 70 years in the usual way by sticking strictly to a scheme of life that would kill anybody else. My habits protect my life, but they would assassinate you. You can't reach old age by another man's road. It is a time of life when you arrive at a new and awful dignity, when you may throw aside the decent reserves that have oppressed you for a generation and stand on your seven-terrace summit, unafraid, unabashed, and look down and teach unrebuked. You can tell them how you got there. It's what they all do. You can explain your process, senile rapture. I have been anxious to explain myself this long time. And now, at last, I have the right. I intend this autobiography to be a model for all future autobiographies when it's published after my death, to be read and admired for many centuries for its form and method, a form and method whereby the past and present are continually brought face to face. Like the contact of flint and steel, I shall talk about whatever interests me for the moment, cast it aside and talk about something else the moment its interest for me is exhausted. It's a system that is a complete and purpose jumble, a course that begins nowhere, follows no specified route, and can never reach an end while I am alive. My Uncle John A. Quarles was a farmer. His place was in the country 4 miles from Florida, Missouri. I have never known a better man than he was. It's a divine place for a boy, that farm of my Uncle John's. House was a double log one with a spacious floor, roofed in, connecting the house to the kitchen. In summertime, the table was set in the middle of that breezy and shady floor. Sumptuous meals, makes me cry just to think about it. Fried chicken, roast pig, wild and tame turkey, ducks, geese, venison just killed, rabbits, squirrels, pheasants, partridges, prairie chickens, biscuits, hot batter cake, hot buckwheat cake, hot rolls, hot wheat bread, hot corn pone, succotash, buttermilk, sweet milk, clobber, muskmelon, watermelon, all fresh from the garden, peach pie, apple pie, pumpkin pie, apple dumplings, peach cobbler. I can't remember the rest. It was the way these things were cooked that was perhaps their main splendor, and these things have never been properly cooked in the North. In fact, it seems to me that nobody here is able to master the art. It seems a pity that the world is willing to throw away so many good things merely because they are unwholesome. The farmhouse stood in the middle of a very large yard, fenced in on 3 sides by rails and on the rear side by high palings. Against the palings was the smokehouse, and beyond the palings was the orchard, and beyond the orchard the tobacco fields. In one corner of the front yard were a dozen lofty hickory trees and a dozen black walnuts, and during the nutting season riches were to be gathered there. Down a piece, abreast the house, there was a log cabin against the rail fence, and there the woody hill fell sharply away past the barn, the stables, the corn crib, the tobacco curing house, to a limpid brook that sang over its gravelly bed and curved and frisked in and out, here and there and yonder, in the deep shade of overhanging foliage and vines. It was a divine place for a wading, and there was a swimming pool, too, which was forbidden us and so frequented by us, for we were little Christian children and had early learned the value of forbidden fruit. In the log cabin lived a bedridden, white-headed old slave woman whom we visited daily and looked upon with awe, for we believed she was upward of 1,000 years old and had talked to Moses. We accommodated all the details that came to us about her, and so believed that she had lost her health in the long trip across the desert coming out of Egypt and had never been able to get it back again. There was a round bald spot on the crown of her head, and we would sneak around behind and gaze reverently on it, recollecting that it had been caused by fright from seeing Pharaoh drown. We called her Aunt Hannah, Southern fashion. Like all Negroes, she was superstitious, and when witches were around, she tied up what remained of her wool in little tufts with white string and immediately rendered the witches impotent. All of the Negroes were friends of ours. And those of our own age were, in effect, comrades. I say in effect, using the phrase as a modification. We were comrades, and yet not comrades. Color and condition interposed a subtle line that both parties were conscious of and that rendered complete fusion impossible. We had a faithful and affectionate friend, advisor, and ally in Uncle Daniel. He was a middle-aged slave and had the best head in the Negro quarter. His sympathies were broad and wide, and his heart was honest and simple and knew no guile. I have had his welcome company a good part of that time and staged him in my books under his own name and as Jim, and carried him all around Hamilton, down the Mississippi on the raft, even across the deserts of the Sahara in a balloon, and he has endured it all with patience and friendliness and loyalty, which were his birthright. It was on that farm that I got a liking for his race and an appreciation for certain of its fine qualities. This feeling and this estimate have withstood the test of 60 years and more and suffered no impairment. The black face is as welcome to me now as it was then. In my schoolboy days, I had no aversion to slavery. I was not aware that there was anything wrong about it. No one arraigned it in my hearing. The local papers said nothing against it. The local pulpit said that God approved, that it was a holy thing, and that the doubter need only look in the Bible if he wished to settle his mind. In Hannibal, we seldom saw a slave abused. On the farm, never. There was, however, one small incident in my boyhood which touched on this matter. We had a little slave boy we had hired from someone there in Hannibal. He was from the eastern shore of Maryland and had been brought halfway across the continent away from his family and friends and sold. He was a cheery spirit, gentle, innocent, and the noisiest creature that ever was, perhaps. All day long he was wailing and whistling and singing and whooping and hollering. It was maddening, devastating. One day I lost all my temper and went raging to my mother, and I said, couldn't she please shut him up? Well, tears came to her eyes. Her lip trembled. She said like this, poor thing, when he can sing, I know he is not remembering, and it comforts me. If he is still, I'm afraid he is thinking, and I cannot bear it. He will never see his mother again. So if he can sing, I must not hinder it, but be thankful for it. It's a simple speech, made up of small words. But it went home. Sandy's noise did not bother me again. She never used large words. She had a natural gift for making small ones do effective work. She came handy to me in several of my books as Tom Sawyer's Aunt Polly. I fitted her with a dialect. Tried to think of other improvements, but I could not find any. I used Sandy in one of my books, too. It was in Tom Sawyer. I tried to get him to whitewash a fence, but it did not work. I can't remember what name I called him by in the book. I remember Dawson's schoolhouse perfectly. I can hear the inviting and drowsy sounds that drifted in through the open window from that distant boy paradise, Cardiff Hill, mingled with the murmur of the students studying, made them all the more dreary by contrast. I remember Mr. Dawson very well. I remember his boy Theodore. He was as good as a boy could be, inordinately good, in fact, extravagantly good, offensively good, detestably good. He had pop eyes, and I would have drowned him if I'd had a chance. In that school, we were all about honor and equality, and as near as I remember, passion of envy had no place in our hearts, except in the case of Arch Fuqua, the other one's brother. In the summertime, we all went barefoot. Arch was a boy of about my own age, 10 or 11. In the winter, we could stand it because he wore shoes, and his great gift was hidden from our sight. We were unable to forget it. But in the summertime, he was a bitterness to us. He was our envy. He could draw back his great toe and let it fly, and you could hear it snap 30 yards away. There was not another boy in school who could approach this feat. He had not a rival as to physical distinction, except Theodore Eddy, who could move his ears like a horse. But he was no real rival because you couldn't hear him move his ears. We're talking of a time 60 years ago and more, and I can still remember the names of some of my schoolmates. And in fitful glimpses, even their faces rise briefly before me, just long enough to be recognized. Then they vanish. I recall Mary Miller. She was not my first sweetheart, but she was the first to furnish me with a broken heart. I fell in love with her when she was 18 and I was 9, but she scorned me. And I realized that the world was a cold place. I had not noticed that temperature before. I believe I was as miserable as even a grown man could be. But I think that my sorrow did not last long, for I soon transferred my affection to Artemisia Briggs. She was a year older than Mary Miller. But when I told her of my passion, she did not scoff at it. She did not make fun of it. She was very kind and gentle. But she was also firm and said she did not want to be pestered by children. In that school were the first Jews I had ever seen. It took me a long while to get over the awe of it. To my fancy, they were invisibly clothed in the damp and cobwebby mold of antiquity. It carried me back to Egypt, and in my imagination I walked among the pharaohs and the other showy celebrities of that remote age. I remember other boys from that period. Irving Ayres. But no matter, he is dead. George Butler. Remember, as a boy of 7, he wore a blue leather belt with a brass buckle. He was hated and envied by all the rest of it because of it. He was the nephew of General Ben Butler, who fought gallantly at the Battle of Ball's Bluff and other actions of the Civil War. But he is dead, long and long ago. Will Bowen, dead long ago. Ed Stevens, dead long ago. John Briggs was a special mate of mine. Now, John is still living. A myriad of men are born, They labor and sweat and struggle for bread, squabble, scold, fight, scramble for little mean advantages over each other. Age creeps upon them. Infirmities follow. Shames and humiliations bring down prides and vanities. Those they love are taken from them, and the joys of life turn to aching grief. The burdens of pain, care, and misery grow heavier year by year. At length, ambition is dead, pride is dead, vanity is dead. Longing for release in their place, it comes at last, the only unpoisoned gift the earth ever gave them. And they vanish from a world where they were no consequence, where they achieved nothing, where they were a mistake, a failure, a foolishness, where they left no sign that they had ever existed. A world that will lament them for a day and forget them forever. For 30 years, I have received on average a dozen letters a year from strangers who remember me. I do not know these strangers or their fathers, and I do not recognize the names they mention. But at last, I have had the refreshment this morning to receive a letter from someone who deals in names that are familiar to me from my boyhood. The writer enclosed a newspaper clipping, and he wants to know if Captain Toncray, lately deceased, is, as stated in the clipping, the original for Huckleberry Finn. Huckleberry Finn, a book of mine in which a sound heart and a deformed conscience come into collision, and conscience suffers defeat. Now, persons attempting to find a motive in this will be prosecuted. Persons attempting to find the moral in it will be banished. And persons attempting to find a plot in it will be shot. Huckleberry Finn is Frank F. Frank's father was at one time the town drunkard, an exceedingly well-defined and unofficial office of those days. He had succeeded General Gaines, and for a while was the sole and only incumbent to that office. But afterward, Jimmy Finn proved a competency and disputed the place with him. So for a while, we had two town drunkards at the same time, and it caused as much trouble in that small village as Christendom experienced in the 14th century when there were two popes at the same time. Tomorrow will be the 36th anniversary of our marriage. My wife passed from this life a year and 8 months ago in Florence, Italy, after an unbroken illness of 22 months' duration. She was slender and beautiful and girlish, and she was both girl and woman. She remained both girl and woman to the last day of her life. During the 9 years we spent in debt and poverty, she could always find a way to reason me out of my despairs, find a bright side to the clouds, and make me see it. She poured forth her prodigal affections in kisses and caresses, and in a vocabulary of endearments whose profusion was always an astonishment to me. I was born reserved as to endearments of speech and caresses, and hers broke upon me like the summer wave, breaking upon Gibraltar. She had the hot, free laugh of a girl. It came seldom, but when it broke upon the ear, it was as inspiring as music. I heard it for the last time when she had occupied her sickbed for more than a year. Made a written note of it at the time, a note not to be repeated. Our firstborn, Langdon Clemens, was born on the 7th of November, 1870, and lived 22 months. Susie was born on the 19th of March, 1872, and passed from this life at the house in Hartford on the 18th of August, 1896. Clara and her mother and I arrived in England from around the world on the 31st of July and took a house in Guildford. About a week later, when Katie and Susie and Jean were to have arrived from America, we received a letter instead. It said Susie was slightly ill, nothing of consequence. This was a great relief to me, but not to her mother. She was frightened. She and Clara went aboard a steamer at once, sailed for America. This was on the 15th of August. 3 days later, when Clara and her mother were halfway across the Atlantic, I was standing in our dining room thinking about nothing in particular when a cablegram was placed in my hand. It said, "Susie was peacefully released today." It's one of the mysteries of nature that a man can receive, all unprepared, a thunderstroke like that, and live. Man's house burns down. The smoking wreckage represents nothing but a ruined home made dear by years of use and pleasant associations. By and by, the days and weeks go on. First, he misses this, and he misses that, then he misses the other. And when he casts about for it, he finds that it was in that house. He had not realized it was an essential thing when he had it, and only discovers this now when he is balked, hampered by its absence. It will be years before this tale of lost essentials is complete, and not till then will he truly know the magnitude of his disaster. We are strangely made. The memories that would make us happy pass away. The memories that break our hearts abide. The summer seasons of Susie's childhood were spent at Quarry Farm on the hills of Elmira, New York. The other seasons at the house in Hartford. Like other children, she was blithe, happy, fond of play. Papa has beautiful gray hair, not any too thick or any too long, just right. A Roman nose which greatly improves the beauty of his features, kind blue eyes, and a small mustache. He is an extraordinarily fine-looking man. When Susie was 13 and a slender maid with long plaits of copper-tinged brown hair down her back, and perhaps the busiest bee in our household hive, she secretly and of her own motion and out of love added another task to her labors, writing a biography of me. How pleased I was, and how proud. When I read it all these years later, it is still a king's message to me. It brings me the same sweet surprise it brought then. Ever since Papa and Mama were married, Papa has written his books and then taken them to Mama in manuscript, and she has expurgated them. Papa read Huckleberry Finn to us in manuscript, and before it came out, he would leave part of it with Mama to expurgate, while he went off to the study to work. Sometimes Clara and I would be sitting with Mama when she was looking at the manuscript, and I remember so well with what pangs of regret we used to see her turn down the leaves of the pages, which meant that some delightfully dreadful part would be scratched out. I can see that little group yet. 2/3 of them arguing for the life of the culprit sentence. I can no longer remember what the condemned phrase was, but it is possible that that particularly dreadful one was cunningly devised and placed in the book for just that purpose. It is possible, for I did have that custom. The other evening, Claire and I brought down our new soap bubble water, and we all blew soap bubbles. Papa blew his soap bubbles and filled them with tobacco smoke, and as the light shone on them, they took very beautiful opaline colors. Papa would hold them and then let us catch them in our hand, and they felt delightful to the touch. The mixture of the smoke and water had a singularly pleasant effect. It's human life. We are blown onto the world to float buoyantly a while on the summer air, showing off our graceful form and dainty iridescent colors, and then, with a little puff, we vanish, leaving behind only a memory, sometimes not even that. When I think of those times 20 years ago and more, a certain pathos clings about them. Susie, with her manifold young charms and iridescent mind, was as lovely a bubble as any we made that day, and as transitory. She passed as they passed, leaving behind only a heartbeat and a memory. The last quarter century of my life has been pretty constantly and faithfully devoted to the study of the human race. That is, the study of myself. For in my individual person, I am the entire human race compacted into one. Broadly speaking, we are all alike. So by carefully studying myself, I have been enabled to acquire a knowledge of the human race that is more comprehensive and more accurate than that which has been acquired and revealed by any other member of the species. As a result, my private and concealed opinion of myself is not of the complimentary sort, and it follows that my estimate of the human race is a duplicate of my estimate of myself. 20 years from now, you will be more disappointed by the things you did not do than by the things you did do. So throw off the bowlines, sail away from the safe harbor. Let the trade winds fill your sails. Explore, dream, discover. I would urge upon you this, which I think is wisdom. If you find that you cannot make 70 by any but an uncomfortable road, don't you go. When they take you from the Pullman and deposit you in the rancid smoker, put on your things, count your checks, and get off at the next way station that has a cemetery. We can't reach old age by another man's road. My habits protect my life, but they would assassinate you. But I am 70. 70. And I would sit in the chimney corner and smoke my pipe, take my rest, read my book, wishing you in all affection that when in your return you arrive at pier number 70, you may step upon your waiting ship with a reconciled spirit and lay your course to the sinking sun with a contented heart. Now then, that is the tale. Some of it is true.